You have to understand something most people never notice about empaths. They do not break in ways you can easily see. There is no dramatic argument, no clear moment where they say they have had enough. From the outside, everything looks the same. They are still calm, still listening, still the most emotionally stable person in the room. But underneath that surface, something is shifting, slowly, quietly, and in a very deliberate way. I have seen this pattern play out again and again in relationships, in high-pressure environments, and in people who have learned to carry more than they should for far too long. The ones who endure the most are usually the ones who leave without warning, not because they are impulsive, but because they have already done the thinking long before anyone else noticed. And when that shift finally completes, there is no announcement, no explanation, just a silence that changes everything. And by the time you realize what happened, they are already gone. Most people misunderstand empaths in a very predictable way. They assume sensitivity equals weakness. They assume that because someone feels deeply, they must also break easily. But in reality, the opposite is usually true. Empaths are not fragile. They are often the most durable people in any environment. Not because they are resistant to emotion, but because they are willing to carry more of it than anyone else in the room, and that willingness is exactly what allows them to stay in situations far longer than is healthy, far longer than is safe, and far longer than most people even realize. An empath walks into a situation and does something most people never bother to do. They do not just look at behavior, they look underneath it. They ask what caused it, what shaped it, what pain sits behind it. And once you start seeing people that way, it becomes very difficult to react in a simple or immediate way. Because now every harmful action comes with a backstory, every disrespect comes with a justification, and every red flag becomes something you can explain instead of something you respond to. This is where the problem begins. Not in their ability to feel, but in their ability to understand beyond what is necessary for self-protection. I have seen this pattern play out in real behavioral environments where people are trained to read others at a high level. Once you can accurately interpret emotional signals and underlying motives, you gain an advantage. But that advantage becomes a liability if you do not have boundaries to contain it. Because instead of using that awareness to make decisions, you start using it to excuse behavior that should not be tolerated. And empaths are particularly vulnerable to this shift because their instinct is not to evaluate first, it is to connect first. And connection without evaluation is where endurance turns into self-neglect. There is also a subtle reinforcement loop happening that most empaths are not aware of. Every time they absorb tension instead of addressing it, every time they smooth over conflict instead of confronting it, they are training the people around them. They are teaching others that this level of access to their emotional energy is acceptable, that there is no real cost for crossing a boundary, and human behavior follows patterns. If something works once, it will be repeated. If it works consistently, it becomes expected. So what starts as kindness slowly transforms into obligation. And what was once appreciated becomes something people feel entitled to receive. This is why empaths tend to stay in imbalanced dynamics longer than others. Not because they cannot see the imbalance, but because they can see too much around it. They see potential, they see intent, they see the moments where the other person almost gets it right. And those moments become enough to justify staying, enough to reset the internal narrative, enough to delay action again and again. And over time, that delay compounds, It creates a gap between what they feel and what they do. And that gap is where most of the damage occurs. Not from a single event, but from the repeated decision to wait just a little longer. From the outside, this endurance looks like strength, and in some ways it is. The empath becomes the stable one, the one who can handle emotional pressure, the one who does not react impulsively, the one who can sit in discomfort without escalating it. And people rely on that. They trust it. They lean on it. But what they do not see is the internal cost of maintaining that role. Because emotional processing is not neutral. It consumes energy. And when that energy is constantly directed outward, there is very little left for internal regulation, for self-reflection, or for recovery. Over time, something begins to shift internally, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. The empath starts to feel the weight of their own experience, not just the emotions of others, but the accumulation of everything they have not addressed within themselves. Every moment they minimized their own discomfort, every time they chose understanding over honesty, every instance where they postponed their own needs to maintain stability in the environment. And this is where the endurance that once looked like strength starts to reveal its cost. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is that nothing external has to change for the internal strain to increase. The same conversations continue, the same patterns repeat, the same people behave in the same ways. But the empath is no longer processing it the same way. There is a growing awareness that something is off, that the equation is not balanced, that the energy going out is not being matched by what is coming back. And once that awareness begins, even at a low level, it cannot be completely ignored. It lingers in the background, influencing perception, slowly altering how interactions are experienced. This is why it is inaccurate to call empaths weak. Weakness would break under pressure quickly. Weakness would reject discomfort early. But empaths do the opposite. They absorb, they adapt, they endure, and that endurance allows dysfunction to persist longer than it should. It creates an environment where imbalance can stabilize itself, not because it is healthy, but because it is tolerated, and tolerance at that level is not sustainable. Eventually, it reaches a threshold, and when it does, the change that follows does not come from a place of impulse. It comes from accumulated clarity. And that is what makes it so decisive when it finally happens. The difficult part about emotional exhaustion is that it never feels like a single moment. There is no clear line where everything suddenly becomes too much. Instead, it builds quietly, almost invisibly, like a kind of internal debt that keeps growing in the background, while everything on the surface appears stable. And this is exactly how it unfolds for an empath, not through one major event, but through a series of small decisions that seem harmless in isolation, but become costly when repeated over time. It starts with something subtle, a moment where you choose not to say anything because it is easier. A situation where you feel discomfort but decide it is not worth addressing. A conversation where you notice something off but quickly rationalize it, telling yourself they did not mean it that way. And none of these moments feel significant on their own. In fact, they often feel like maturity, like emotional control, like you are choosing peace over conflict. And in the short term, that is exactly what it looks like. You avoid tension. You maintain harmony. You keep everything running smoothly. But there is a cost attached to every one of those decisions, and that cost does not disappear just because you chose not to act on it. It gets stored, not in a dramatic or explosive way, but in a quiet accumulation that most people never track consciously. Every time you suppress a reaction, every time you override your own instinct, every time you absorb something that should have been addressed, you are adding to that internal ledger. And over time, that ledger begins to matter more than any single interaction. What makes this process even more complex is that the environment adapts to it. People around you begin to adjust their behavior based on what you tolerate, not necessarily because they are intentionally taking advantage, but because human behavior follows patterns. When there is no resistance, there is no reason to change. So the small things that you let pass once become things that happen again, and then again, until they are no longer seen as exceptions. They become the baseline. And this is how imbalance slowly normalizes itself without anyone explicitly acknowledging it. For an empath, this is particularly dangerous because their threshold for understanding is so high. They can see the nuance in behavior. They can interpret tone, context, emotional state, and intention, which means they can justify almost anything if they try hard enough. And that ability to contextualize becomes a double-edged sword. Instead of protecting them, it keeps them engaged in situations that are gradually draining them. Because every time something feels off, there is always an explanation available that makes it seem reasonable to stay jot. I have seen similar patterns in behavioral analysis settings, where individuals are placed in environments that slowly shift expectations over time, not through force, but through gradual normalization. The person does not notice the change because each step is small. But if you compare the starting point to the current state, the difference is massive. And that is exactly how emotional exhaustion develops, not through intensity, but through consistency, not through a single violation, but through repeated tolerance of smaller ones. Another layer to this is the internal narrative that empaths often carry. They take pride in being the one who can handle more, the one who does not react impulsively, the one who understands when others cannot, and that identity reinforces the behavior because now endurance is not just something they do, it is something they believe they are supposed to do. And once a behavior becomes tied to identity, it becomes much harder to question because stepping away from it feels like losing a part of who you are. So instead of addressing the imbalance early, they continue to absorb it, telling themselves it is temporary, telling themselves it will balance out eventually, telling themselves that their understanding will make a difference. But what actually happens is the opposite. The more they absorb, without response, the more the system around them adjusts to that pattern, and the more difficult it becomes to interrupt it later. Because now it is not just about one situation, it is about an established dynamic that has been reinforced over time. Eventually, the emotional cost begins to show up in subtle ways. Interactions feel heavier than they used to. Conversations require more energy. There is a sense of fatigue that does not seem tied to any specific event, and this is where many people get confused. Because they cannot point to a single cause, there is no clear explanation for why they feel the way they do. But the reason is simple. They are not reacting to one moment. They are reacting to the accumulation of many moments that were never fully processed. This is why it is accurate to think of it as a kind of debt. Because just like financial debt, it builds quietly. It compounds over time, and it eventually reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. And when that point comes, the response is rarely proportional to the last event that occurred. It is a response to everything that came before it. all the unspoken frustrations, all the minimized discomfort, all the boundaries that were never enforced. And by the time it surfaces, it carries the weight of all of it at once. And this is where the shift begins, not as a reaction to a single incident, but as a recognition that the pattern itself is unsustainable, that the cost of continuing is greater than the discomfort of change. And once that realization starts to take hold, even at a low level, it sets the stage for something much more significant. Because now the empath is no longer just experiencing the situation. They are beginning to evaluate it. And that evaluation is what eventually leads to the turning point. Most people assume that breaking points are emotional, that there is a moment where everything becomes too overwhelming and the person reacts. But that is not how it works for an empath, especially one who has spent years managing, absorbing, and regulating not just their own emotions, but the emotions of everyone around them. Their threshold for intensity is already high, which means it takes a lot to create a visible reaction. And because of that, the shift that actually changes everything does not come from a spike in feeling. It comes from a change in thinking. The real turning point is not when they feel too much. It is when they start asking a different kind of question, because up until that moment, their focus has always been outward. They are trying to understand, trying to interpret, trying to make sense of other people's behavior. They are asking why someone acted a certain way, what caused it, what they might be going through, and how they can respond in a way that keeps the situation stable. But that pattern has a blind spot. It never fully examines the cost to themselves. At some point, usually after a long period of accumulated strain, something subtle shifts, and the empath asks a question that redirects their attention inward, not dramatically, not even out loud sometimes, but internally it changes the entire framework they have been operating from. Instead of asking, "How can I understand them?" they begin asking, "Why am I still tolerating this?" And that single shift in perspective is more powerful than any emotional reaction, because it breaks the automatic loop they have been running for years. From a behavioral standpoint, this is where awareness interrupts pattern. The empath is no longer just processing input and responding based on habit. They are stepping outside of the pattern and observing it. And once you can observe a pattern clearly, you can no longer participate in it the same way. Without noticing the contradiction, this creates a kind of internal tension, not between them and the other person, but within themselves, between who they have been and what they are starting to see. This is why the moment is so quiet. There is no need for confrontation yet, no need for external change, because the real shift is internal. They begin to recognize their own role in maintaining the dynamic, not in a self-blaming way, but in a structural way. They see where they overextended, where they overexplained, where they accepted behavior that did not align with their own standards, and that recognition carries a different kind of weight. It is not emotional overload. It is clarity. Clarity is uncomfortable in a different way than emotion. Emotion can be processed, expressed, or even suppressed temporarily, but clarity stays. Once you see a pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the dynamic, you cannot fully go back to participating in it unconsciously. And this is where the empath begins to change. Not because they want to create distance, but because continuing the same behavior now feels inconsistent with what they know. There is also an important distinction here that often gets missed. This shift is not driven by anger. In fact, many empaths do not feel intense anger at this stage. what they feel is something closer to dissonance, a sense that something is off, that their actions and their awareness are no longer aligned. And that misalignment becomes harder to tolerate than the original discomfort they were trying to manage. So, the motivation to change does not come from reacting to others. It comes from resolving that internal inconsistency. I have seen similar shifts in high-level behavioral training environments where the most significant changes in behavior do not come from external pressure, but from a moment where the individual recognizes a pattern in themselves that they can no longer justify. Once that recognition happens, the change that follows is usually decisive, not because it is impulsive, but because it is the result of accumulated observation, finally reaching a conclusion. For the empath, this conclusion is often simple but deeply unsettling. They realize that their ability to understand others has not protected them from being harmed, and in some cases, it has enabled that harm to continue. And that realization challenges a core belief they have been operating under, that if they just understood enough, responded correctly, and stayed patient, things would eventually balance out. But now they see that understanding without boundaries does not create balance, it creates access. This is the point where the question changes again, becoming more precise, more direct. They start asking, what happens if I stop accommodating this? What happens if I do not explain? What happens if I allow the situation to unfold without intervening? And these questions are not hypothetical. They lead to small behavioral changes, subtle at first, but significant in their impact because they begin to alter the dynamic that has been in place for so long. And once those changes begin, even in small ways, the system responds. People react differently, patterns shift, and the empath gains new information, not through analysis alone, but through observation of what actually happens when they step back, and that is when the process accelerates. Because now they are not just thinking differently, they are experiencing the results of that different thinking in real time. This is why the breaking point is not an explosion. It is a reorientation, a shift in where attention is directed and what questions are being asked. And once that shift takes hold, everything that follows becomes inevitable. Because the empath is no longer operating on autopilot. They are making conscious evaluations, and conscious evaluation changes behavior, even if nothing has been said out loud. Yet, after that internal shift happens, the change is not loud. It does not come with confrontation or clear statements. In fact, to most people, nothing seems different at first. The empath is still present, still engaged, still part of the conversation, but if you pay attention closely, something subtle has changed. They are no longer doing as much work as they used to, not physically, but emotionally and conversationally, and that difference starts to reshape every interaction they are part of. Before this point, explaining was almost automatic. If there was tension, they would smooth it out. If there was confusion, they would clarify it. If someone misinterpreted them, they would correct it, not because they needed validation, but because they wanted alignment. They wanted things to make sense for everyone involved. And they believed that with enough clarity, most issues could be resolved. So they filled in gaps. They translated emotions. They made communication easier for everyone else, often without realizing how much effort that actually required. But now that awareness has shifted inward, something else becomes clear. Not every misunderstanding is accidental. Not every gap in communication needs to be filled, And more importantly, not everyone is interested in true understanding. Some people benefit from ambiguity, from keeping things unclear, because it allows them to avoid responsibility. And once the empath recognizes that pattern, the value of constant explanation begins to collapse. Not emotionally, but logically, so they stop, not abruptly, not in a way that draws attention, but gradually. They begin to leave space where they would have once filled it. They let silence exist where they would have once explained. They allow conversations to unfold without steering them toward clarity. And this is where the dynamic starts to change, because most people are not used to that kind of space. They are used to the empath managing the emotional flow, keeping things balanced, making interactions smooth. And when that structure is removed, even slightly, the interaction becomes different. In behavioral analysis, there is a concept that when you remove support from a system, you begin to see its true structure. And that is exactly what is happening here. Without the empath constantly adjusting, translating, and absorbing, people start revealing more of their natural patterns. Their assumptions become more visible, their intentions less filtered, their inconsistencies easier to detect, and the empath, now operating from a more observational position, starts to see things they could not fully see before. This is the moment where they transition from participant to observer, and that shift is significant because participation involves emotional investment, while observation creates distance, and distance creates clarity. When you are not immediately reacting, not immediately fixing, not immediately engaging at the same depth, you begin to notice patterns that were previously masked by your own involvement. You see how often someone deflects, how they respond when not accommodated, how they handle silence, and how quickly they become uncomfortable when they are no longer being guided through the interaction. You will often see subtle reactions from others at this stage. Questions like, "Why are you being distant?" Or "Is something wrong?" But what they are actually reacting to is not distance in the traditional sense. It is the absence of something they had come to rely on. The empath's tendency to carry more than their share of the interaction, to make things easier, to absorb tension before it could fully surface, and without that, the interaction requires effort from both sides, and not everyone is prepared for that shift. For the empath, this phase is not about withdrawal. It is about recalibration. They are still listening, still aware, still capable of deep understanding, but they are no longer offering it automatically. They are observing first, collecting information, allowing patterns to reveal themselves over time instead of trying to resolve everything in the moment. And that approach changes the quality of their awareness. It becomes more precise, less influenced by immediate emotional input, and more grounded in consistent observation. There is also a strategic element that begins to develop here, even if the empath is not consciously thinking in those terms. By not over-explaining, they remove the opportunity for others to hide behind confusion. By not filling every silence, they create space for others to show who they are, without guidance. And by not immediately reacting, they introduce a delay that allows them to choose their response instead of defaulting to it. And that delay is where control starts to return. What makes this stage uncomfortable for others is that the empath is no longer predictable in the same way. They are not as easy to read, not as easy to influence, because their responses are no longer immediate reflections of what they feel. They are considered, filtered, intentionnel, And when someone who used to be open and accommodating becomes measured and selective, it changes the entire dynamic of the relationship. Even if nothing explicit has been said, from the outside, it can look like they have become quieter, less expressive, maybe even less caring, but internally, the opposite is happening. They are paying more attention than ever, just in a different way. They are no longer trying to manage the interaction, they are trying to understand it as it is, without interference. And that shift from managing to observing is what allows everything else to fall into place. Because once you see clearly, you no longer need to control the situation to understand it. You only need to watch. What most people do not realize is that distance does not just create space, it changes what you are able to see, because when you are too close to something, especially emotionally, your perception is influenced by your involvement, your reactions, your desire to keep things stable. But once that distance is introduced, even slightly, the entire structure of the interaction becomes clearer in ways that were not available before. For an empath, this is a completely new experience. Because for most of their life, they have operated from immersion. They step into situations and immediately begin feeling, processing, adjusting, which means they are always inside the dynamic, rarely outside of it. And when you are inside something, you are responding in real time. You are adapting as things happen. But you are not always seeing the full pattern. You are seeing moments, not structure. Distance changes that because it removes the urgency to respond. And when there is no urgency, attention shifts from reaction to observation. Instead of asking, "What do I do next?" the empath starts noticing what is actually happening over time. And that is where clarity begins to form. Not from a single interaction, but from repeated patterns that start to align in a way that is difficult to ignore. They begin to notice inconsistencies that once felt minor, things like someone's words not matching their behavior, promises that are made easily but not followed through, emotional responses that seem appropriate in the moment but do not hold up over time. And these are not new behaviors. They were always there, but they were filtered through empathy, explained, softened, or dismissed. Now, without that constant filtering, they appear more defined, more consistent, more real. There is also a shift in how they interpret behavior. Before, they would give weight to intention, was what the person meant, what they were going through, what they might have felt in that moment. But with distance, they begin to give more weight to patterns, not what someone says once, but what they do repeatedly, not how they explain themselves, but how they behave when there is no pressure to perform. And that shift from intention to pattern is where discernment begins to take shape. This is where the empath starts asking different kinds of questions, not emotionally driven questions, but evaluative ones. Is this person consistent? Do their actions align with what they claim? How do they respond when I am not accommodating them? What changes when I stop making things easy? And these questions are not asked out loud. They are observed through behavior, tested through subtle shifts in interaction, and answered through what unfolds over time. One of the most revealing moments in this phase is what happens when the empath stops compensating, because for a long time they have been carrying more than their share of the interaction, smoothing over tension, clarifying misunderstandings, maintaining balance. And when that effort is removed, even slightly, the dynamic has to adjust. And in that adjustment, people reveal who they actually are, Without that support, some step forward and meet the new level of mutual responsibility, while others become uncomfortable, defensive, or inconsistent. This is often where others begin to feel the change. Even if they cannot articulate it, they might say things like, "You have changed," or "You feel different." But what they are reacting to is not the presence of something new. It is the absence of something they had relied on. The empath's constant effort to maintain harmony, and without that, the interaction requires equal contribution, and that exposes imbalance very quickly. From a behavioral perspective, clarity comes from reduced interference. The less you try to control or manage a situation, the more accurately you can observe it, and that is exactly what the empath is now doing. They are no longer shaping the interaction to make it work. They are allowing it to show its natural form, and in doing so, they gain access to information that was always there but never fully visible. This phase can feel unsettling, even for the empath, because clarity is not always comfortable. It often confirms things they had previously avoided acknowledging. It removes the benefit of doubt they once gave freely, and it forces them to confront the reality of certain dynamics without the protective layer of explanation. But at the same time, it is also stabilizing, because once you see patterns clearly, you no longer have to guess. You no longer have to interpret every situation from scratch. You can rely on observed consistency. What makes this transformation so significant is that it changes how they engage moving forward. They are no longer driven by the immediate emotional context. They are guided by accumulated observation. They are no longer reacting to what someone says in the moment. They are responding to what that person has shown over time. And that shift introduces a level of precision that was not there before, because now their decisions are based on evidence, not assumption, and this is why distance becomes so powerful. Not because it disconnects them from others, but because it reconnects them with reality. It removes distortion, reduces emotional noise, and allows patterns to become visible in a way that changes how everything is interpreted, because once you can see clearly, you do not need to overanalyze, you do not need to over-explain, you simply recognize what is there, and that recognition is what ultimately shapes the choices that come next. Detachment is one of the most misunderstood shifts in this entire process. Because from the outside it looks like something has been lost, people see less reaction, less urgency, less emotional expression, and they assume it means coldness or a lack of care. But internally, what is actually happening is very different. It is not the removal of emotion. It is the introduction of control over how and when that emotion is engaged. And that distinction is what changes everything. For most of their life, an empath operates in a state of immediate responsiveness. They feel quickly. They react quickly. They adjust to the emotional environment without hesitation. They pick up on tone, tension, subtle cues, and they respond in real time, which allows them to connect deeply, but also means they are constantly being influenced by what is happening around them, often without any filter, and over time, that creates a system where their internal state is shaped more by external input than by their own choice. After prolonged exposure to imbalance, something begins to shift. Not because they decide to shut down, but because their system adapts. It creates a gap between what they feel and how they respond, and that gap is where detachment begins. Not as emotional absence, but as a pause, a delay, a moment where they no longer react automatically. They observe first, process second, and only then decide if a response is necessary, and that delay introduces something they did not have before: control. From a behavioral perspective, this is one of the most important transitions a person can make. Because most people operate on impulse, they react based on immediate emotion without examining it. But once you create space between stimulus and response, you gain the ability to choose, and choice reduces reactivity. It removes predictability, and it limits how much influence others have over your internal state. And for an empath, that shift is transformative. This is why detachment often feels unfamiliar, because the pattern has changed. Situations that would have once triggered an immediate reaction are now met with stillness, not indifference, but controlled engagement. They are no longer rushing to fix, no longer stepping in to stabilize every interaction. Instead, they are assessing, allowing things to unfold without interference. And that alone changes the dynamic in a way that others can feel even if they cannot explain it. For the people around them, this can be uncomfortable because they are used to a certain level of emotional availability. They are used to the empath absorbing tension, offering reassurance, maintaining balance. And when that response is no longer automatic, it creates uncertainty. They may interpret it as distance or withdrawal, but what they are actually experiencing is the absence of overextension, not the absence of care, but the removal of automatic accommodation internally. This stage can create its own tension because the empath has often built their identity around being the one who feels deeply and responds accordingly. So when that response changes, there is a moment of confusion, a quiet question. Why am I not reacting the same way? Why does this feel different? And it can seem like something important has been lost. But in reality, something else has been gained. They have not lost their ability to feel. They have reduced their willingness to feel everything without limits. That distinction matters, because detachment is not suppression. Suppression ignores emotion and pushes it down, creating pressure that builds over time. But detachment, when developed properly, is structured. It allows emotion to be recognized without being immediately internalized. It creates a filter, a boundary that determines what is allowed in and what is not. And that boundary is what protects their energy while maintaining awareness. There is also a natural protective function happening here. The nervous system, after repeated exposure to emotional overload, begins to reduce unnecessary input, not by shutting everything out, but by becoming selective, by distinguishing between what requires engagement and what does not. And this selectivity is what makes the empath's presence feel different, quieter, more grounded, less reactive, because they are no longer being pulled in every direction at once. At the same time, there is a balance that has to be maintained, because if detachment becomes too rigid, it can create distance not just from harmful dynamics, but from meaningful ones as well. And this is where awareness becomes critical. The goal is not to disconnect, but to regulate, to remain open where there is mutual respect, and close where there is imbalance. And that requires continuous adjustment rather than a fixed state. What makes this stage powerful is that it restores agency. The empath is no longer reacting based on habit or expectation. They are choosing based on observation and evaluation. They are no longer absorbing everything and sorting it out later. They are filtering in real time. And that shift reduces emotional fatigue while increasing clarity. because now their internal state is not constantly being shaped by others. It is being managed deliberately, and this is why detachment should not be confused with coldness. Coldness is absence. Detachment is control. It is the difference between not feeling and choosing what to feel. And once that distinction becomes clear, the transformation makes sense. Because the empath has not become less, they have become more precise, more intentional, and far more in control of how they engage with the world around them. At this stage, something fundamental changes. Not in what the empath is capable of, but in how that capability is used. Because for most of their life, empathy was automatic. It was a reflex. They walked into a room and instantly began reading people, adjusting, feeling, responding, without effort and without conscious control. It was simply how they operated. But now that same ability is no longer running unchecked. It has become deliberate, directed, and selective. And that shift transforms everything about how they interact with the world. They still notice the same details, tone shifts, inconsistencies, subtle emotional cues. But they are no longer immediately engaging with them. Instead of asking, "How can I help this person feel better?" they begin asking, "What is actually happening here? What is consistent? What is repeated? What is real beyond the surface?" And that change in questioning moves them from emotional immersion into analytical awareness, where empathy is no longer just something they feel, it is something they apply. This is where many people begin to use the term dark empath. Not because the empath has become negative or malicious, but because their behavior no longer fits the expectation others had of them. They are no longer openly accommodating, no longer predictably responsive, no longer offering understanding, without evaluation. And when someone who was once emotionally transparent becomes measured and controlled, it creates a sense of unpredictability that can feel unsettling to those around them. The difference now is that empathy is no longer given freely. It is allocated. The empath observes first, evaluates patterns, and then decides whether the situation or the person deserves that level of engagement. And this decision-making process introduces a level of precision that did not exist before. Because it is no longer based on immediate emotional input, it is based on accumulated observation over time. And that makes their responses more accurate, more grounded, and far less influenced by manipulation. There is also a deeper layer to this transformation, because when you understand people at that level, you are not just able to connect with them, you are also able to influence them. You see their insecurities, their motivations, their patterns of behavior, and that awareness gives you leverage, whether you intend to use it or not. And this is where the process becomes more complex, because awareness itself is neutral. It does not determine how it will be used. It only expands what is possible. At this point, the empath stands at a kind of internal crossroads. On one path, they use this awareness to protect and refine their relationships. They set clear boundaries. They engage only where there is mutual respect. They invest their energy in environments that are balanced and sustainable. And their empathy becomes a tool for connection, but one that is controlled, measured, and intentional. On the other path, that same awareness can be used to shape outcomes, to influence behavior, to subtly guide interactions in ways that benefit them. And while this is not inherently malicious, it introduces a different dynamic, one where understanding becomes a form of power rather than just connection. What makes this stage so significant is that the empath is no longer operating from assumption. They no longer assume good intent without evidence. They no longer ignore inconsistencies to maintain harmony. They no longer give unlimited access to their emotional space. Instead, they observe, they evaluate, and they choose. And that choice creates a level of asymmetry in interactions because while most people are still reacting based on impulse and habit, the empath is responding based on awareness and intention. This is why they become harder to read, harder to influence, and harder to predict, not because they are hiding something, but because they are no longer expressing everything in real time. They are filtering, selecting, deciding what to reveal and what to withhold. And that introduces a level of control that changes how others experience them, especially those who were used to the earlier version of the empath. The one who explained everything, gave freely, and responded immediately. From the outside, this can feel like a loss, like the empath has become distant or less engaged, but internally it is the opposite. They are more aware than ever, more precise in how they interpret behavior, more intentional in how they respond, and more grounded in their decisions because they are no longer driven by the need to be needed or the habit of overgiving. They are guided by discernment, by pattern recognition, by evidence gathered over time. There is also a philosophical dimension to this stage that cannot be ignored because once you see people clearly, once you understand behavior at that level, you cannot return to a state of unawareness, and that raises a question that every empath eventually has to answer. What do you do with that clarity? Do you use it to build stronger, more honest connections? Or do you use it to control outcomes and manage people? And the answer to that question defines the direction of their transformation. What is certain is that they are no longer naive. They are no longer operating from blind trust or automatic compassion. They have integrated empathy with discernment. And that combination is powerful, because now they are not just someone who feels deeply, they are someone who chooses carefully. And that shift from reaction to intention, from reflex to control, is what ultimately defines this final stage. Because empathy has not disappeared. It has evolved into something far more structured, far more selective, and far more aligned with self-respect.